It's the Misfits.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Ministry Misfits. Andrew and I are still got the streak going that we're in studio.
Yes, even though you got beat up.
Yeah, if you're watching on video, this week I have a black eye.
That's true. This is the worst. If you're watching the video, it looks a little bit different. It may even be a little bit more high def at the moment. Our other camera is playing hide and seek. So we're using a different camera that we really only have for this week. And it's nice HD for Brandon's black eye.
Yeah, so Andrew and I got into a disagreement now. That didn't end well.
We couldn't agree on what episode number this was. And so finally I had enough.
That's more of a realistic take to it. But no, in boxing this week, took a right hook to the face. So
yeah. Obviously, we need to work on our defense a little bit.
That's right.
So, in other fights that have been going on this week,
In the Twitter world.
not just on Twitter, this is happening beyond just Twitter. There have been multiple debates about who Christians are actually called to serve and what we are supposed to do about things like what had happened on the New York subway this past week with the homeless man that was killed.
Mm-hmm.
There are conversations about whether or not he deserved it. There are conversations about whether or not he should have been fed. There are all these different conversations, and there's a lot of bad takes, is the nice way of putting it, about what Christian responsibility actually is to the homeless community, to people that are non-Christians. We're having conversations about mental health, which we're going to have a much bigger mental health conversation in a few weeks.
Yeah, which May is Mental Health Awareness Month.
And so we're going to have that discussion, but that is not the discussion we are having today. The discussion we're having today is about who is it that Christians are actually called to serve. Honestly, most of you should be like, this is like a super simple thing. Why are we having to do a full episode on this?
Yeah, it sounds like
I would agree with that.
Yeah, it sounds like this should be a Sunday school.
This should be Sunday school.
Coloring book time, and we'll get some animal crackers and be on our way.
Unfortunately, though, it's become very apparent that this is not at least being taught in some Sunday schools, because the people that are having these debates all have Christian and pastor in their bio, profile, whatever you want to call it. So we're going to answer the question about who Christians are called to serve. And the answers are found primarily in Luke 10, Matthew 25, and Luke 6. There's a lot of other verses that answer these questions, but these three passages specifically answer the question full stop, no questions asked. It's pretty laid out, nice, easy to read. We should be able to do this, which is, again, why we're not quite sure why we need to have this discussion. But for some reason we do. So we're going to start, and we're just going to walk through these three passages. We're walking through them in a specific order based off of the debates that have been going on. So the first thing that we're going to look at is in Luke chapter 10, which we talked about this a few weeks ago, and we gave a nice big dialogue on it and then realized that we were talking about the wrong chapter because I had mislabeled it.
That's right.
So we're actually going to talk about it correctly this time. And we're looking at Luke chapter 10. Now, most people know the story of Luke chapter 10. Everybody knows the whole thing about the Good Samaritan.
Mm-hmm. But
we need to start a little bit before the Good Samaritan story itself. So what happens, there's a religious leader that comes to Jesus and thinks he's going to stump Jesus by saying, "What's the greatest commandment?" And so the response is, we love God and we love our neighbor, right?
Yep.
Greatest commandments. Pretty straightforward. Everybody is in agreement. Yep, you got this one right. Loving God is the biggest commandment because it's literally commandments 1 through 4 of the 10 commandments, which is a whole nother debate that we almost had.
We've kind of partially tackled.
We've tackled it before.
One correlates to almost all 10.
But 1 through 4 is about loving God, right? No other gods, no idols, don't blaspheme him, keep his days holy. pretty straightforward. Love God 1-4. That's out of Exodus 20. Then the second commandment is like it. Love your neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
Loving neighbor is commandments 5-10. If you're keeping 5-10, you will be loving your neighbor. It's also pretty much the entire law. I mean, the law was designed so that you are not harming your neighbor. And it's also what we see in Micah chapter 6, right? He's already told you what is good. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God. That's loving our neighbor. It's also loving God, and it's loving our neighbor. And all of it should be a natural byproduct of doing 1-4 and loving God.
Mm-hmm.
That right there, for the most part, I don't think anybody is going to be in disagreement about. It is very straightforward.
Yes.
Except for that, it wasn't straightforward to the man that asked Jesus the question. And so what is the man's response to all of this?
I'm trying to remember if he's left confused on...
Well, not confused.
He
He wants to keep pushing the issue to see if he can trap Jesus. And so he asked the question, who is my neighbor?
Yes.
And so Jesus goes into a little bit of a story mode here. And so he shares the story of the Good Samaritan, which we're going to just walk through and paraphrase a little bit with some different details that we want to highlight. So the story of Good Samaritan, you have a man that's leaving Jerusalem, headed towards another region in Judea. So we know he's Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And he's attacked by robbers, a little bit more than Brandon. He's beaten, left for dead on the side of the road. And we are pretty confident because of the fact that where he's at, all of this stuff is going on, that the robbers that beat him up were also Jewish. So we have a Jewish man beat up by other Jews. And then a priest comes walking by, passes right on by. And the priest is the teacher of the law, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones that teach the law. Then you have a Levite walk by, which the Levites are the servants of God, the servants of the law. They are set apart from the rest of Israel. And he walks on by. And then you have a Samaritan who's the half-breed outsider that nobody likes and is considered unclean, and they don't worship right, and nobody likes him. The Samaritan man picks him up, delivers him to the inn where the doctor is at, pays for all of it on his own tab, and also says whatever is left over, continue to care for this man, and I'll pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus shares this story and asks the man, which one followed the law, followed the commandments? And he responds with the one that showed mercy. And so Jesus says, yeah, go do that.
Mm.
Paraphrasing, that's basically what it says is, right, go do it. You already knew the answer. Mercy is what was being defined as loving of neighbor. And then Jesus also is making it very clear that everyone is our neighbor, right?
Yeah.
Because mercy does not have any kind of distinctions as far as who it's supposed to be shown to.
No, and typically it's something from the mercy standpoint, if we look at it where God shows us mercy for we deserve death from sin and our punishment, that he shows us mercy, and that, again, as we've talked about, by loving God, loving others should be a byproduct, and by recognizing and acknowledging the mercy that God gives us, we should also have that same byproduct of mercy to others.
Right, because loving God should produce loving neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of what Jesus also is pointing out by who he chose to show up in the story. The teacher of the law, somebody that knows what the law says and what the responsibility is here, ignored it and kept on moving. A Levite who is set apart by God to serve God and to follow 1-4 explicitly, even more so than everybody else, sees it and walks on by. It's somebody that is not a part of any of the responsibilities, not a part of the law, doesn't have any knowledge of it, most likely, that does what God has asked. And so the one that actually followed the great commandments that showed that they loved God and loved their neighbor is the one that showed mercy and the least likely to be the one that we would think of showing it.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're going to leave that there. We know we just opened up the can of worms already.
For everybody else asking.
For everybody else
But what
asking,
about
well,
this?
Yes. We're going to leave that there for a second. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to go to the next story that has caused all the controversy before we actually get to the giant can of worms that we've already opened.
We'll be right back.
Today's a great day to start your own podcast. Whether you're looking for a new marketing channel, have a message you want to share with the world, or just think it would be fun to have your own talk show, podcasting is an easy, inexpensive, and fun way to expand your online reach.
Buzzsprout is hands down the easiest and best way to launch, promote, and track your podcast. Your show can be online listened on all major platforms within minutes of finishing your first recording. We just switched to Buzzsprout for Season 2 and have immediately noticed the difference.
With Buzzsprout, you get a great-looking podcast website, audio players that you can drop into your websites, detailed analytics to see how people are listening, tools to promote your episodes, and more. Podcasting isn't hard when you have the right partners, and Buzzsprout and the Misfits want to help you get started.
Contact us for a free consultation call, and then visit our affiliate link to get started with Buzzsprout. Using this link not only helps support the Misfits, but it also gets you a $20 Amazon gift card. The teams at Buzzsprout and Ministry Misfits are passionate about helping you succeed. Join over 100,000 podcasters already using Buzzsprout to get their message out to the world. To find out more, go to www.ministrymisfits.com/affiliates.
What's up, everybody? Joe here from Buddy Walk with Jesus. Buddy Walk with Jesus is a show designed to delve deep into the intimate reality of God's present kingdom through raw and honest conversations. And I'd like to invite you guys to join us as we continue on our journey through the book of Matthew. Whether you start from the beginning or jump in at the latest episode, we'd love to have you along for the ride as we seek to unpack the heart of God through the personhood of Jesus. You can find Buddy Walk with Jesus anywhere where you can find podcasts, including our newest home over on YouTube Podcasts. You can also head on over to facebook.com/buddywalkwithjesus. Engage with me over there, as well as our community group at the Buddy Walk community. Remember two very important things: that you are prayed for and you are loved deeply. Peace, y'all.
Oh, hello there. My friends call me Brother Matthew. You can too. And I have spent most of my adult life learning history, theology, apologetics, really Christian academia. But recently, I've discovered you can amass all of this knowledge, but not understand God or understand what it means to live out what you believe. If that's you, then follow me on this journey at brothermatthew.net, and we'll discover together how to move from knowledge to understanding, how to have the mind of Christ in the heart of Christ.
We're back.
All right, everybody, welcome back. So we are doing the discussion that shouldn't even be a discussion today.
Yeah. I was like, unfortunately, the people that may need it won't listen to it, but who knows?
Yeah, well, at least it's out there, right?
Yeah.
So we're
Same with the Bible, but
exactly. So we're walking through the question of who is it that Christians actually are supposed to be serving,
or loving,
or loving, and what all that means. Now, we've already seen Jesus deal with one person, ask the question directly of, who am I actually supposed to do this to?
Yeah, who's my neighbor?
And his response was, everybody, Just go do it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not good enough, apparently. We still have to have the discussion about other passages as well. The big one right now is coming out of Matthew chapter 25, which Matthew 25 has a lot of different stories covering a lot of different things. This is Jesus's last hurrah of sharing stories with his disciples, because the next chapter is where we see Jesus get arrested. So this is right before that. He's giving information as far as multiple different things. He's got the parable of the virgins, the talents, and now the one we care about is the sheep and the goats, which already we've talked about before. As far as one of the reasons that this causes a bunch of controversy is that people try to interpret this for Christian nationalism.
Mm.
It's not. If you've never listened to anything we've talked about, we'll make this very clear. There's no biblical support for Christian nationalism.
No.
And this chapter is especially not one of them. And we'll get to why it's definitely not one of them as we walk through it. So Brandon's going to go ahead and read this for us. We're going to start in verse 31, and we are going to end at the end of the chapter with verse 46.
Yeah, so starting off in verse 31, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from one another, just as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you as a stranger and take you in, or without clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will answer them, "I assure you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me." Then he will also say to those on the left, "Depart from me, for who are cursed into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you didn't take me in. I was naked, and you didn't clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you didn't take care of me." Then they too will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or without clothes, or sick, or in prison, and not help you?" Then he will answer them, "I assure you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me either." And they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life.
So the place that people try to claim this to be Christian nationalism is the idea of God dividing up the sheep and the goats. And it says that it's all the nations are gathered before him.
Mm-hmm.
But just like we've talked about in other places, this is talking about all of the individual people of a nation, all in front. Everybody is there. This is judgment. And so Jesus is going to divide everybody up based off of if they're sheep or they are goats. Now, to start with, if you ask a lot of people throughout Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
what is the answer that you would get from a lot of people as far as how Jesus actually is going to divide everybody up as far as if they're a sheep or a goat? It's based off of their what?
Would be Jew or Gentile?
There are some that are still claiming that. A lot of people, though, are saying it's based off of what doctrine you hold to, right?
Like believer or unbeliever?
Not even believer or unbeliever, but did you have the right type of Christianity? Based off of teaching. Did you speak in tongues or did you not? Were you baptized this way or were you not? A lot of the stuff we talked about last week.
Yeah.
Things that we end up having major division among the church over. Were you Baptist? Were you Presbyterian? Oh, were you a Catholic?
Were you baptized when you were a baby
Right.
or when you were an adult?
All of these different things is what a lot of people try and say is how God is going to judge everybody at the end. That's not at all what we see here. Everybody is divided up based off of how they treated the least of these. That's the dividing factor. It has nothing to do with belief. It has nothing to do with the Bible translation they're using. It has nothing to do with how many people they've won to Christ. It has nothing to do with any of that. It's all based off the treatment of the least of these. Now, one thing this does not cover is saying that you are saved by your works. And we'll get into that next week. This week, we're just focused on the fact that Jesus is already divided. This is where he's dividing up as far as who is actually a true believer or not. And what he's basing everything on is treatment of the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the homeless, the imprisoned, and the sick. And he says that the way you treated them is how you treated Christ himself.
Yeah.
Not about their beliefs, not about their theology. It's the same thing that he talked about in Matthew chapter 7. When he says, not everyone that says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
They'll say, didn't we preach
you.
in your name? Didn't we prophesy in your name? Didn't we do miracles and wonders and all these other things? And you'll say, depart from me, I never knew you.
Mm-hmm. That's scary.
Which is scary. And it's the same thing we see here. It has nothing to do with the amount of preaching you've done or the amount of churches that you've planted or the amount of people that you've saved. It's all about how you have treated the least of these.
Mm-hmm.
But the question that gets raised, just like we saw in Luke chapter 10, is who is my brother? Or who is Christ's brother?
Yeah.
Because that's what we see in verse 40. Verse 40. The king will answer them, I assure you, whatever you did for one of the least of these my brothers, you did for me. So the question is, who is my brothers? Because the claim that we're hearing lately is that only Christians is Christ's brother. And so if that's the case, then only Christians must be cared for. That is what we're going to spend a little bit of time unpacking. The Greek here for brother literally means brother. It's adelphos, which is the same thing we get for Philadelphia, right?
Yeah.
We've talked about this before. It's brother, Delphi, brother. So who is it that Jesus is talking about? Because we know it's not just talking about his actual flesh and blood brother.
Mm-hmm.
It's not all about if you were nice to James or not. It's not talking about necessarily even just people that are Jewish, which could also be a translation that we've heard before as well. This is part of the whole thing of like, we have to support Israel because Matthew 25. But that doesn't really fit with anything else that he's talking about.
No.
Does it mean that it's only Christians we are supposed to care for? And that is what, again, we are going to unpack. So what we are saying here is that it can't just mean brother in Christ. Because we assume from this that he's not only talking about males.
As well.
Right?
Yeah. Brother and sister.
Other places he talks about brothers and sisters. But here he just says brothers. So if this is a literal, the way you treat our brothers is how you will be judged, then it doesn't matter how we treat the females in Christ.
Mm-hmm. Which is what some people do.
Which is part of the problem, right?
Yes.
So why do we only assume it's talking about Christians?
Because we see that word brother and think of the close unity of somebody that is typically blood related. And so we associate that to being a Christian within our circle.
Right. Family of God. It's all about Christ's blood, all that. But why do we suddenly assume that Christ only cares about how we treat other believers. Because we don't see that anywhere else in Scripture.
No, the only word close would be they'll know you are Christians.
By our
Our
love,
love.
but that doesn't specify who it's going to.
Correct.
And what we're going to see the next chapter, when he gets arrested, is he's being arrested for everybody, not just the people that are going to believe. And especially then when we get to verse 45, where we have the opposite reaction from the king, because we've had the opposite actions happening before. The king answers, I assure you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. There's no distinguisher here.
Mm-mm.
There was a distinguisher up here where it was good stuff. You were doing that towards the brethren. But when we're talking about judgment, it was the least of these, everybody. Poor treatment of the least of these is the actual issue here.
Mm.
Which does mean that if we are talking about, we are caring for those outside our walls, but not caring for the brethren, we have a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because up top, if you're not taking care of the brethren, you're not entering in. This is part of the requirement.
Yeah, you're not showing that mercy or that love of Christ.
But that doesn't mean that if we ignore the least of these that are not within our walls, that we've met the test.
Mm.
The brethren is the minimum requirements. Because if we don't take care of the least of these, we still are cast out into judgment. We are called to serve the least of these without any distinguishers, without any exceptions, without any of it. This is what we just talked about in Luke chapter 10. The two people that passed by the man that was beaten were his brothers.
Yes. Knew the law and
Knew it better than
looked
anybody
like him.
else, was called to serve people and serve God, specifically those two positions, and yet they kept on walking and ignored their brother. They have not passed the first test for the sheep, which means they definitely aren't going to pass for the goats. We are called to treat everyone as if we are as if they are Christ himself. And when we say everyone, we are meaning everyone. And that includes the people that we don't even like.
And I know we were going to potentially talk about that this evening, but I always think of this of the Imago Dei.
Right.
First and foremost, too, of, all right, if everybody we see that's in need and or not, we just need to be looking at everybody like that's an image bearer of Christ, which we should be doing anyways.
Right. It's his image.
Yes.
So it's not that hard for us to think that potentially we are serving Christ himself.
Mm-hmm.
They're made in his image. Christ is the creator. So when we ignore the cries of the creator's creation, we are ignoring the cries of the creator himself.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it says. This is not just some liberal social justice type of thinking, which is what the argument is. We are called to serve the least of these. No exceptions, nothing else. Because if we start to try to make distinguishers and exceptions, suddenly we're asking, well, who is my neighbor or who is my brother? And we saw how Jesus responded to that. Mercy is the call, go do it.
Mm-hmm.
No exceptions, no distinguishers. It's just we are called to serve. And like we said, it gets very difficult because of the fact that it's easy to talk about loving our brother. It's easy to talk about loving our neighbor. But it gets even harder because those things are the easy part. But that's not the end of what Jesus has told us we have to do. Because in Luke 6, Jesus shakes everything up and makes us all feel horrible about trying to do any of this. So Luke chapter 6, we're going to go there next. And we're looking at verses 20 through 38.
Then looking up at his disciples, he said, "You who are poor are blessed, because the kingdom of God is yours. You who are now hungry are blessed, because you will be filled. And you who now weep are blessed, because you will laugh. You are blessed when people hate you, when they exclude you, insult you, and slander your name as evil because of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy. Take note, your reward is great in heaven, for this is the way your ancestors used to treat the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your comfort. Woe to you who are now full, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are now laughing, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all people speak well of you, for this is the way of their ancestors used to treat the false prophets. But I say to you who listen, love your enemies, do what is good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If anyone hits you on the cheek, offer the other also, and if anyone takes away your coat, don't hold back your shirt either. Give to everyone who asks you, and from one who takes your things, don't ask for them back. Just as you want others to do for you, do the same for them. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do what is good to those who are good to you, what credit is it that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those for whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do what is good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Then your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he is gracious to the ungrateful and evil. Be merciful, just as your Father is also merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured onto your lap. For the measure you use, it will be measured back to you.
Now, some of this should sound pretty familiar
Mm-hmm.
because of the fact that this is the Beatitudes. This is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount out of Luke rather than Matthew. And so we start with the Beatitudes, right?
Yep.
If you're
Blessed are the poor
blessed are the poor,
versus poor in spirit.
blessed are the hungry, blessed those who are weeping, you're blessed when people hate you. Woe, this is where it gets a little bit different in Luke compared to Matthew. Woe to you who are rich. You already have your comfort. Woe to you who are full, for you're going to get hungry again. Woe to you who are laughing, for you will mourn and weep. And woe to you when people speak well of you, because this is how they used to treat the false prophets. It's a little bit different than when we read it in Matthew, where it's just blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, all those sort of things.
Mm-hmm. We're seeing
We're seeing
the outside physical
the outside of it, and
appearance.
it should also look a little bit familiar with what we just read in Matthew 26. For I was
hungry.
I was thirsty, which would be hungry.
Mm-hmm.
I was sick.
I was naked and you clothed me.
I was naked and you clothed me. I was in prison. You visited me.
I was a stranger.
It's the Beatitudes.
Mm-hmm.
This is part of why it should not be hard for us to recognize that Jesus came for the oppressed. Because that's what we have here. He gave us he showed it to us in the Beatitudes. And then he clarified that if you're doing those things that I asked you to do, you're doing them to me.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't do these things that I asked you to do, not only are you just straight up ignoring me, but you are not doing these things to me.
Yeah. And I think probably the most challenging part of all of this is, again, we like to be that person talking to Jesus. Was it in Luke, or I forget which one we first started off with, but basically asking, who is my neighbor?
Right.
And I think we like to try to create any little caveat that we can of, all right, Jesus, do I have to do this every time? Like every time I see somebody asking for money, anytime everybody's asking for help? And the short answer, yes.
Yeah. And again, we talked about this when we talked biblical giving.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus calls for 100%. Does it mean we're always going to do it? No. Does it mean there is some nuance with the way the world is as far as how we go about doing these different things? Yeah. Does it mean that God's going to throw us into hell the first time we mess up? Absolutely not. That's what the gospel is all about.
Mm-hmm. That's why we have mercy.
That's what mercy is. That's what the entire stories that we're reading is all about. But Jesus' message was for the oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
It is good news to the poor, and it is not good news to those that oppress others. And this is what we see out of Luke 4 when Jesus gives his theme, his ministry theme here. Out of Isaiah he read, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor." Pretty straightforward. Good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom to the captives, the oppressed, to proclaim recovery of sight to the blind, and to set free the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Part of why these discussions have suddenly popped up again is because of one little word that is used here. Oppressed.
Mm.
Because what is it that everybody assumes if we're talking about oppression that we are mentioning? Or we're talking actually about? It's all about
Race.
Marxism, right? Because Marxism is the one that divided us into oppressors and those that are oppressed. It's right here. Jesus came to declare good news to the poor and to set free the oppressed.
Mm.
That's what we see in Luke 10, right?
Mm-hmm.
Love God, love your neighbor, and then we are to care for other people's physical needs. It's what we see in Matthew 26. We care for those that are hurting, that are sick, that are in prison, that are enslaved. We care for them and we go to them. We feed the hungry. We provide water for the thirsty. The gospel message is good news to those that are oppressed, and it is bad news for those that want oppression to continue.
And I think the frustrating part that I see is just people not treating people with any dignity or respect. Again, going back to the Imago
Right,
Dei.
we're back to Imago Dei again.
Like if somebody comes up to them on the side of the street and asks them for something, just completely ignores or acts like they're not even there. Again, that's continuing to dehumanize them, one. But yeah, it takes away that image of God. And I always have the comparison of like, if that was a celebrity there on the street or somebody that you knew or recognized, you would immediately say hello or treat them completely differently. But because of the external situation or that there's no benefit to you,
right,
or to your circle or to your pocketbook, that you don't treat them like a person. You don't even talk to them. You won't even make eye contact with them.
Or the next step of it where people are saying that it is out of fear. I don't know if I can trust this person. I don't know if it's safe for me to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And so we just go on our way. But what does Paul say in 1 Corinthians 13? What casts out fear?
Love.
Love. The thing that we're talking about that we are supposed to be going and doing. Love casts out fear. These things are not actually supposed to be that complicated. Jesus made it very, very plain and clear throughout all of the Gospels as to what our responsibility as believers are. And it is not just to other believers. Because this right here in Luke 6, the next section after the Beatitudes, he straight up says, love your enemies.
Mm-hmm.
And that is actually the distinguishing mark between a believer and a non-believer. Because all these other things that we talked about in these other parts of this episode, Good Samaritan, when we talked about this with the clothing and feeding of the poor and everything like that, Matthew 26, non-believers do that stuff all the time. Unfortunately, they do it better a lot of the time. And that's a huge argument as well. People say, well, no, Christians are the ones that have done this, this, and this across the world.
Yes, but
But why did Christians do it across the world?
Mhm.
Because Jesus gives us a few things within this passage as far as how we're supposed to do it. It says to give and not expect anybody to give anything back. To give more than people are asking for. To do it without any kind of questioning.
Mhm.
We don't need to get all of their information and expect them to show up Sunday morning before we hand them a piece of bread. If somebody comes asking for money, don't say, no, we'll give you a gift card because we're afraid you're going to go spend it on alcohol and drugs.
Mhm.
If somebody comes up to us and says, I'm hungry, can you feed me? And you have an extra piece of food, hand it over. And don't expect them to convert right there on the spot. That's not why we do this.
Yeah.
Because it's the non-believers will go and do all this stuff, and they'll do it all the time, because why wouldn't you do it to somebody that you are going to get a benefit out of?
Mhm.
We are called to do it when there is no benefit. This is the test of a disciple. Love those that will not return the favor. Love without conditions. Give without expectation of receiving anything back. That's what loving as a disciple of Christ actually looks like.
Mhm.
Loving in the midst of fear. Regardless of if you think, oh, maybe this person is not telling the truth. Regardless of, oh, this guy may be trying to take all my money. Which we talked about in biblical giving. It's not our money anyway.
Mhm.
We are called to love our enemies just as much as we're called to love our brothers and love our neighbors. And so this is where it gets to be, unfortunately difficult, even though it shouldn't be. Because regardless of your stance on Luke 10,
Who your neighbor is.
Which most people will somewhat agree on that one. Regardless of your stance on Matthew 26, which is where all the controversy is coming from. Luke 6 takes away any possibility of getting out of loving somebody.
Mhm.
And I'm saying that very specifically as far as getting out of it. Because that is the reality of what people are doing.
Yeah.
Is they're trying to find an excuse to not love somebody.
Yeah, we try to justify with God why we shouldn't, why we're not qualified. I think is it Moses when he's
Right,
telling
yeah.
God of
I
I'm not-
stutter.
I'm not qualified for this.
Right.
And then maybe that's not the greatest example, but I think we try to disqualify ourselves on purpose of I don't have the resources to help this person. I don't have the words to say. I don't know their culture. And so we immediately try to put up barriers and things in place to not even step in those situations in the first place and just stay inside our Christian bubble where we can be safe and provide things that we see helpful.
Normally, though, when we're trying to disqualify ourselves, again, we're talking normally out of fear,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also normally, at least we lie to ourselves and say that it's out of a place of humility also, right? I'm not good enough for this.
Mm-hmm.
You need somebody better. God, you deserve somebody better. That's different than what we're talking about here. Because what we're talking about here is looking for an excuse not to care for somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about humility, even if it is fake humility. It's all about pride. There is no other way of saying it. It is all about pride, because you are saying that you are too good to care for this person. You are too good to stop and pick up the guy on the side of the road,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's your brother. You are too good to go to somebody that may be sick, and I potentially get sick as well, and then I can't go to work, and then now suddenly I can't go to work, I'm not going to get paid, and I can't tithe as much, and so I'm actually helping the church by not going.
Mm-hmm.
The lies that we tell ourselves as an excuse to not do these things. That is not what we are called to do. No exceptions, no conditions. We love our neighbors. we love our brothers, we love our enemies. And in doing so, we are loving God
Mm-hmm.
by doing these things. That's it.
Yeah.
It's not this complicated.
Yeah. Again, on paper, it's not complicated, but the true implication of it, again, hopefully in our heart to heart, which that's why this topic is being brought up, we should say, yes, this is what I believe. This is what I'm calling to. And then, yes, we will go out into the world and stumble and
Right.
not.
The application is much harder.
Yes.
But the theology behind it is not.
Correct.
The theology is super simple. Love your enemies, love your brothers, love your neighbors, and in doing so, you fulfill the greatest commandments of loving them and loving God. That's it. That's all we need. That's all the theology that you need to be able to do this stuff. As far as actually applying it, now we're getting back into what we talked about last week of the fruits of the Spirit and the gifting of the Spirit to actually be able to go about doing these things, allowing the baptism of the Spirit to renew our minds, to be able to not think about our safety and actually love somebody.
Mm-hmm.
We're not saying that the application is easy, because it can't be. If it was easy, everybody would be doing it. That's literally what Jesus says here in Luke 6. Everybody does stuff for the people they love and that love them. I'm telling you to go the next step and love the
Love your
people
enemies.
that don't love you back. And that only can happen when we are consumed by the Spirit and not by ourselves. This is going back into our Bible study in Galatians with the idea of the flesh versus the Spirit. You know, one of the things Paul says in Galatians 6 is to try to outdo each other in doing good.
Mm.
But that's to each other.
Yeah.
If we can outdo each other doing good to each other, then we should be able to do good to those outside our walls as well. And if we are doing these things, we will see the people that are outside the walls eventually start to want to wander in. You know, this is part of the thing that always is so confusing, besides the fact that this becomes a complicated discussion, is why we think that if we are only called to believers and to help believers, why we think that anybody that is a believer would even want to listen to us.
Mm.
Again, this is the Roman versus the Celtic evangelism styles a little bit here. If we are only called to care for those that are believers, the only reason that people are going to come in and want to be a part of it is because they think they are going to get the care finally.
Yeah, they think they're going to get something.
Which, again, now we're back to what we just read. Their love for God is not actually love for God. It's love for returning of love.
Yeah, or a title.
Or a title.
Or safety.
Or safety, or being able to actually have a meal now. And this, again, we're going back into what we talked about in Philippians, the idea of your God being your stomach.
Mm-hmm.
This is part of why feeding the hungry is part of the gospel. How is somebody going to be able to hear the message of hope when they are starving?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're telling them, oh, God wants me to give you this food after you have committed to him, that's a transaction, that's not faith. And this is where, again, we're going to get into this more next week between the idea of faith, faith in Christ and works salvation. This is the difference. This is living out our salvation. There's no transaction here other than the fact that we have been forgiven, we have been loved, and now we are showing that love to others. We are not doing this to gain salvation. We are doing this because our salvation demands it of us.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to, if I do this, God is going to bless me and I won't be hungry, I won't be sick, I won't be anything else, which is part of why Jesus starts out the Sermon on the Mount with, when you're poor, you're blessed. When you're hungry, you're blessed. When you weep, you are blessed. And when people persecute you, you are blessed. Because it's not about the physical wealth.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the spiritual reward of being in relationship with Christ. That is what it's about for those of us that believe. but it also doesn't mean that we don't care for the physical wealth and physical needs of those that can get it on their own.
Yeah.
So this is a shorter episode because, again, the theology is pretty simple here. It's super simple. It's super simple. The application is not, but the theology is.
Mm-hmm.
So let us know what you think. Let us know why you think we're wrong, and we'll again show you how simple this theology is. You can do so going to any of the social media channels, going to the website, mysterymisfits.com. You can do so through Twitter is the place where a lot of these conversations are happening.
True.
All that good stuff. YouTube. Good Pods now also has some social media features that are a little interesting, a little fun because they don't always work right, which makes it very interesting.
Does YouTube have it yet? Well,
the YouTube, some of you, shout out to the new YouTube podcast followers as well. We are on YouTube Podcasts if you want to go there. Basically, YouTube Podcasts is the exact same thing as your normal podcast channels, except for with video. So if you have, I believe you have to be a YouTube Music subscriber to be able to access the actual RSS feeds. But if you subscribe to the Ministry Misfits podcast on YouTube Podcasts, then you'll get notified and the video will show up in your playlist every week. You also will want to go and subscribe to the 12 Days of Misfits, which is a separate podcast on YouTube. So that way, come Christmas time, you don't miss watching Brandon's head spin
for the third year.
Yes. So in the meantime, also Patreon up and running. The Bible study is over. We finally got to the end after almost going
9 weeks.
Yeah, 9 instead of 6, but we got there. But you can still access all of that going to patreon.com/Ministry Misfits. Join any of the different levels, and you'll be able to get all of that good stuff, as well as eventually we're going to do another live show, and you'll get access to be able to get a backstage pass for that as well. What else we got? The store's up.
The merch, new merch, the 90s merch. The
Misfit Paul merch.
Yeah.
And then also all of the Tikva gear, which the money from that goes back to support the work that Tikva is doing a lot of the stuff we just talked about, feeding, clothing.
Yeah, that's one thing
others.
I was kind of thinking about is like the education system that
right.
They in some roundabout way recognize that
even beyond the education system, they literally are feeding and clothing the kids in our neighborhood. Mm-hmm. So they definitely are doing exactly what we talked about today.
Yes.
So in the meantime, like we said, next week we're going to dive into the second half of this discussion, which is what actually we're dealing with when we talked about the difference between faith and works, which we talked about in the Bible study. So if you don't want to wait till next week, throw $3 at us on Patreon and you can do it all in the meantime. So we'll see you guys all next week.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/Ministry Misfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/Ministry Misfits.